you to undo the water for me.
Welcome, everyone. While we're completing our settling in and sound tests, I wanted to give you a warm welcome to this event with Claire Tomalin and Kai Bird. Welcome to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm the provost of the Graduate Center and a professor of classics. So I'm here really to say a couple of words about the Graduate Center, so those of you who haven't been here before know who we are and what we do, before I hand it over to Kai, who's going to say a few words about Claire Tomalin and about their conversation. The Graduate Center, and as I hope you all know, but in case you don't, is an educational institution. It's the doctoral granting institution of the City University of New York. We have about 4,000 students studying here at any given time, pursuing a master's degrees and doctoral degrees in programs across the arts and sciences, and also programs like urban education, and educational psychology. We've got a really rich range of programs here. We're also honored, and this is part of what makes us a really special educational institution, is we're not just an educational institution, a school for students and faculty who teach them. We don't just support teaching, we don't just support research in deep connection with teaching. We're also honored to be the host of about 30 centers and institutes that advance research outside the scope of our academic programs, that interface in really innovative and creative and interesting ways with the city, with organizations, centers rather, like our Center for Urban Research, which provides most of the graphics about demographics and voting patterns that you'll see in publications like the New York Times, and also this center that connected to our event tonight, the Leon Levy Center for Biography. The Leon Levy Center for Biography was established with the support of our very generous patron, Shelby White, Leon Levy's wife. She is a great promoter, an eloquent advocate for the value in biography that Leon Levy felt, I think, held and advocated for all his life. And these values associated with the understanding of biography underpin the event tonight. I'm a classicist, as I said at the beginning, and I'll just close by saying that in the ancient world that I study, of the ancient world of the Mediterranean, Greeks and Romans trying to figure out, many of them, the best way to live in a collective, in a polity, in a political community, they held the study of an individual life and the understanding of an individual life to be one of the most effective and engaging, compelling ways to prompt all of us to think about what that good life is on the individual level, on the collective level. So it's with that insight, I think, that Leon Levy and Shelby White has continued this legacy by setting up this center. That really sits at the center of everything we do, the belief that the scholarly study, the sustained, intensive examination of a life has so much to offer us, not just because we're interested in that individual person, but because we're interested in big questions of ethics, of cultural change, of history, of politics. So I will hand it over to Kai now with one final word of thanks to Shelby White, who made this and many other events possible, and thanks to you also for being here and sharing what I know is going to be a very special evening with Kai Bird and Claire Tomalin. Thank you.
Good evening. I first met Claire Tomalin in Jaipur, India, nearly a decade ago. We were on a panel together at the Literary Festival, and she charmed me. And now she has once again charmed me with her emotionally taut and quite mesmerizing memoir. Claire is perhaps, I want to say, our greatest living English biographer. And like too many good biographers, she started out as a journalist and literary critic. Her biographies include Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, Samuel Pepys, Jane Austen, Catherine Mansfield, Mrs. Jordan's Profession, The Invisible Woman, the story of Nellie Ternan and Charles Dickens, Shelley and His World, and the first The Life and Death of Mary Wollstonecraft. Claire has twice won the prestigious Whitebread Book Award in 1974 and again in 2002, beating out her husband, Michael Frayn, who happened to be nominated the same year for his novel, Spies. Michael is here as well, somewhere in the room, and tomorrow night he will be speaking about his career as a playwright in the Skylight Room at 6:30 p.m. But we are here tonight to have a short and scintillating conversation, I hope, about Claire's new memoir, A Life of My Own. I will interrogate Claire for 30 minutes or so, maybe 40, and afterwards we'll have time for questions from the audience. And I don't know, maybe there'll be time for signing of books out in the hallway.
Sure.
And so with that, I'm going to begin a few questions.
It's great to be in New York. It's just a city I love to come to. So I'm really happy to be with you. Our two countries are going through difficult times.
Really?
So we have to sort of stick together, don't we?
So I want to begin with something that you say about biography in your memoir. Working on a biography means you are obsessed with one person and one period for several years. Another life is bound up with yours and will remain so for the rest of your own life. At least that is my experience. Then you go on to say, you will have setbacks and gloomy times. I cannot remember being bored, although I sometimes felt desperate, asking myself whether I should have ever embarked on so difficult a task. That seems to sort of sum up my own feelings as a biographer. It is a really hard thing to do, and it takes years. And I think you were like 53 when you became a full-time biographer, resigning your job as the literary editor of the Sunday Times. But it seems quite clear that over the next 3 decades, this was the happiest part of your life. You really enjoyed the life of a working biographer. So can you explain a little bit about?
Yes, I think I can. I was early interested in history, and history fascinated me. And I decided when I was, about 12, that historical fiction, which a lot of my friends were reading, was much less interesting than the real thing. And I bought myself J.A. Neal's biography of Queen Elizabeth. We just called her Queen Elizabeth. We only had one then. When I was 12. I've got the copy still. And I thought it was the most marvelous book I'd ever read, and I read it and I have reread it over the years. And I suppose it somehow stayed with me that this was something that might be worth doing. I believe profoundly that all human beings are interested in the lives of other human beings, and that to be able to introduce readers to a thrilling person and put them, I so much agree with what Joyce said, that you can learn so much from people's lives. I feel I've learned about, looking at the deaths of people like Jane Austen, like Pepys, the courage with which people approach the end of their lives, just one of the things. The way people struggle with terrible difficulties when they want to live a good life. Like Dickens, who was such a good man and then came to a crisis and was so, in a way, outraged by himself that he behaved worse and worse. These are all such important and interesting lessons and things you can learn from biography. And you're quite right, I have absolutely loved working on biographies. Though I did also enjoy being a literary editor and being a reviewer and having a family, my children. I mean, there's many other pleasures in life, but yes, professionally, biographies meant most to me.
So it's difficult, but working alone at home, day after day,
Well, that's
It's
all
a
right.
lonely, that's the life of a writer, yes.
And I did say that you never lose them, because you don't. They stay with you forever. And people go on writing to you, but they are like, I mean, this sounds ridiculous and sentimental, but they're like a sort of family, your people. New things are discovered, something people want to ask you questions, people want to make a film perhaps, or television, and you are perpetually in touch with them forever.
So you begin this memoir, A Life of My Own, by at one point saying, writing about myself has not been easy. Why?
Well, have you written about yourself?
I have.
I was
very different.
I was taken out to lunch by a publisher called Andre Deutsch in London when I was in my 40s, and he said, "You've had a very interesting life, Claire. You ought to write a novel for me." And I thought about that, and I said, well, I don't write fiction. I can't write fiction. But then I began to think, but of course my life is a story. There is a story there. Now, the thing is about fiction, as Henry James said, beware the arbitrary stroke if you're writing fiction. I could never write fiction. But writing lives are nothing but arbitrary strokes. So the whole structure of a biography is utterly different from the structure of a novel, because you go from this one arbitrary stroke to another. And it is, and I began to think, could I write about myself? I would like to know more about my origins, about my parents. I've lived through a very interesting period, especially for women. I would like to give the sort of historical testimony of my experiences as a woman. I was born in 1933, so I remember Munich, I remember the war. I lived through the setting up of the welfare state. I lived through our getting our first woman prime minister. I went to university at a time when in England only just over 3% of the population went to university. Isn't that extraordinary? I mean, you've done much better in America, but in England it was really. And I lived through all the sort of medical and moral changes of the 1960s. So I began to think, I'd like somehow to try and give my account of this. And then my father, who lived to be 98, when he died, my stepmother sent me a big box with all the letters I'd ever written to him, which he'd kept pretty well, every letter I'd ever written to him from the age of about 11. So I had this, and I had diaries, not literary diaries, but I realized that in my study there were boxes of, I'd written sometimes particular incidents in my life. I had sat down and typed out an account of them, and I sort of kept those. So I thought maybe I could put all this together, and I sort of talked to my children about their memories. And yes, it was difficult.
So how long did it take you to write this?
I'm not sure. I did it after Dickens, so a few years, yes.
Shorter than the biographies take.
A bit, yes. And one of the things I realized, I think, writing about myself, that I couldn't put everything in, that I had to sort of decide I'd do it in chunks. I'd sort of do this bit and this bit and this bit. Otherwise, it would have been a complete mess.
Now, speaking of, you just mentioned your father, and that causes me to ask, can you tell us about your conception? Which is, I think, a rather shocking story.
Well, curiously, I can, because my father wrote his own. My father was French. He wrote his own memoir. And he and my mother met innocent young people who'd come to London, and London was the city of their dreams, and they fell in love and married. And it was a disaster, the marriage. So my sister was the child of their honeymoon, was a love child, and my mother wanted to have another child, but my father by then really hated my mother. And he described in great detail how on holiday with my mother in Cornwall, he decided he hated her so much that they were walking along a cliff path, and he thought, I could push her off and no one would ever know it hadn't been an accident. But he didn't do it. But he said it was the only time in his life he'd felt he wanted to commit a murder. That night, in their hotel, my mother wordlessly put her arms around him, and I was conceived. I was conceived against my father's wish and with my mother's passionate wish. And I was born to a mother who was a perfect mother, who gave me unconditional love, who described my birth to me as the most joyous occasion, gave me a great feeling that it was wonderful to have children. And I knew she loved me. And I knew my father didn't like me. And so that was quite difficult. My father began to like me when he saw that I was clever, supposedly clever. And he lived this long life, and I had, as well as my mother, whom I loved, I had a stepmother who became a great friend too, and somehow gave me a link with my father. So, but it was an odd, why he wrote it, I don't know. Why he should write that down, but also, why didn't I ask him about it? Because I didn't. So I was somehow not able to ask him.
Well, it's an awkward question.
It is an awkward question. Why? What a funny thing to write down.
Well, that's one of the differences I discovered when I wrote a memoir, having written biography, is that they're really different beasts in some ways. And the memoir is more about, or a lot of it can be about memory. And memory is very slippery. I remember you wrote from letters that your father saved of yours. I remember at one point in my little childhood memoir, I was writing a chapter about some incident in my life in Jerusalem, and I sent it to my mother, who was then still alive, and she wrote back very quickly and said, no, you have it all wrong. And I said, but Mom, I'm citing your letter for that memory. And she said, no, it wasn't like that. And in her memory, of course,
It had changed.
It had changed.
Yes, but you trusted your memory. Well, you were trusting a letter.
I was trusting the
Yes.
letter. As an historian biographer, I would
Yes.
sort of side
Yes.
with the written word.
But you're quite right. You have to ask yourself. You have to be very careful, and it's good to get someone to confirm. But I do trust a lot of my childhood memories because they were so vivid. When I was at a boarding school, the French lycée was evacuated we were all sent out of London, and we were put into a house, a most beautiful house on the edge of Lake Ullswater, if any of you have been to the Lake District in England. And I fell ill, and the doctor said I must not go to classes, I could just wander about. So I wandered about, and it was April, and I wandered along the edge of Ullswater, and I saw daffodils, a great mass of daffodils, and I was a child who read poetry, and they were Wordsworth's daffodils, and it was just an unforgettable and very vivid experience. And I trust that memory absolutely because it stayed with me and I can still see it, and it meant so much. And another memory from that year at the lycée, on the 14th of July, this was in the middle of the war, we all met with all the teachers. There were many male teachers as well as female ones, and we sang the Marseillaise. And I saw that all the male teachers had tears running down their cheeks. And I had never seen men cry. I didn't know men cried. And they were crying for the shame of France, of course. And that's, I trust that memory because it was so powerful.
So, Claire, your life has been both extremely privileged and lucky in some ways. But it's also been marked by personal tragedy and your daughter being the victim of depression. But the story of your son, who also had severe adversities, nevertheless, in your accounting, it's actually an uplifting story about the human spirit. Talk about Tom a bit.
Yes, for my last child, Tom, I had an earlier son who died as a baby. And I said, is there any risk this could happen again? And they said, no. So then I had another daughter. And then I had a son who was born with spina bifida, which meant his spine wasn't properly closed. And he's now 48. He's had an extremely difficult life. He's never been able to stand up. He's had many problems. He's intelligent, but he had a bit of brain damage. He's very intelligent. He's very independent. He lives by himself and he organizes his own life. I wrote about him partly because I tried not to write about my children on the whole because, you know, it's a bit embarrassing for them. But also, the world for disabled people has changed so much in his lifetime for the better, and it's so important that we keep agitating for conditions for disabled people. I think it's America that began to change things for disabled people, and it was the Vietnam War, because all those young men who came back, who had experience of being able-bodied and then found they weren't, they were able to fight for the rights of disabled people. And I've always been grateful to America, because the ideas about what you should do for disabled people then began to work in England. I mean, I knew families when my son Tom was a baby who would never take their child outside because they were so ashamed of having a disabled child. And things have got much better, but we have to keep sort of fighting for that, don't we? So I'm very proud of my son, but I can't say his life has been entirely happy. I mean, he's very lonely. It's very lonely being a disabled person. Facebook opens up something for you marvelously. That is one of the good things about Facebook. But I've learnt a lot by the sort of struggles you have to have as the parent of a disabled child.
So another adversity as such was quite clearly your first marriage, which was a difficult marriage at times, according to your memoir, to the British journalist Nicholas Tomalin. And then Nick is suddenly, tragically killed in the October '73 war while visiting the Golan Heights in the midst of the war, suddenly out of the blue by a missile, leaving you with 3 daughters then and Tom. And then here's my question. 4 years later, you found in the attic a pack of love letters from a whole series of women, and you threw them away. And my question as a biographer...
That's what Michael said to me. He said, "You're a biographer. Why did you do that?" I was fed up. I mean, Nick was a wonderful man. He was charming, he was brilliant, he was a wonderful journalist, he was brave, and he was a terrible husband. The lesson I learned, we married, we wanted to have 6 children, we were going to have this ideal life, and then he would, then we began to have the babies, and then I was at home with the babies, writing children's book reviews, the sort of things you did in my generation if you were a young woman graduate, Your kind friends who were in the real world sent you children's books to review, which was lovely for my children because we got the books. So then he would fall in love with some beautiful girl because he was very attractive and he was great fun. And so he would say, "I want a divorce," and then he would change his mind, and this went to and fro. And after some time of this, I had a very, very modest, quiet, insignificant affair, and someone told him about it, and he came back into the house one evening, and I was standing in the kitchen, and he came up to bash me. And as I write in the book, at that moment I thought, Mozart and Beaumarchais are right. It's all right for the Count to do what he likes, but it's not all right for the Countess. And an English reviewer, who's a friend of mine, said, "I was fed up when she wrote that. I didn't want to know what she thought about whether I wanted to know who her lover was." And I didn't tell. You can't tell everything, can you? But I did really think that. It did come as a moment of culture and real life. He's going to hit me if he thinks I'm unfaithful to him. But I'm not allowed to do anything to him. I have to put up with it, and the children have to put up with it.
So we're in a Me Too moment.
You could say that. You could say that, yes.
Have things changed since the 50s and 60s when you were first married?
Things changed
or
in the 60s.
Are things never going to change?
Things changed in the 60s, yes. Yes, things have changed. What hasn't happened is life hasn't got any easier for women. Somehow we thought that as we Germaine Greer and everything and all your wonderful American feminists, that things would really change. But I see my stepdaughters, my daughters, it's just as hard for them. If you have children and you have a job, it is by definition, very hard. It's very difficult to get things right. I do remember some of my memories of those periods we were talking about. I just tell a few tiny stories. When I had my second child, it meant to be born at home, but I had a placenta previa, so I had to be rushed into the nearest hospital, which was an old workhouse hospital. Do you know what workhouses were in England, where very, very poor people were? And we lived in Greenwich, outside London. So I was lying in a ward where there were about 60 beds and young women. But next to me, in the bed next to me, there was a very beautiful, sophisticated-looking girl with perfect blonde hair and Vogue on her bed and fingernails, and she said, "Would you like to read my Vogue?" And I don't really read Vogue, but I said, "Yes, thank you." And so there she was. I was waiting to have my baby. She didn't seem to have a baby. And after 2 days, she disappeared. And the sister said to me, she had a little boy, and he's gone to be adopted. And that's 1958. You know, she thought it was safe. She must have been part of a smart life. She was perhaps a model in London. She thought it was safe to go out to this hospital and have a baby and lose that baby forever. And I thought it was, I've never forgotten that experience because it was so vivid and upsetting. Next tiny experience, after I'd had my fourth child, I had my postnatal, and after I'd been examined, we sat, and my doctor behind the desk picked up a packet off the desk and said, "These are pills that could stop you getting pregnant. Would you like some?" They were the pill. And I said, yes, of course. You know, I mean, I knew about birth control, but having a pill was something different, wasn't it? And at that moment, morality changed, really. Women suddenly had a power that they hadn't had in their sexual relationships. The third tiny story, my father came over from France to stay with us in the late 60s, and I went out with him the first morning after he'd arrived into the streets of London, and he stopped, and I saw him looking terribly shocked. And then I saw him begin to smile, and then he started to beam. And he'd never seen before girls walking along with skirts just skimming their knickers. You know, he was completely amazed by the sight of English girls in their miniskirts.
So things have changed.
Yes, things have changed, yes.
So that brings us to your first biography. How did you choose Mary Wollstonecraft? I used to call her Mary Who because nobody can ever say Wollstonecraft. I'm writing about Mary Who. Well, I was working for the New Statesman, and I got pregnant with my son Tom, and so I was given Richard Crossman, the politician, was the editor of the New Statesman. And he said, "Take some maternity leave, and James Benton will fill in for you while you're off, and then you can come back. But write a lot of pieces for the New Statesman while you're off." And I was reading the letters of Mary Wollstonecraft, whom I hadn't heard of at university. And I thought she was absolutely extraordinary. Woman in the 1790s, she wrote a vindication of the rights of woman. She went to Paris to see the revolution in action, and she wrote extraordinary fragmentary novels about women's situation. She was altogether an amazing woman. So I wrote a page piece for the New Statesman, and it was published. And the next day, in those days the post was rather better, I got letters from publishers and agents saying, "You must write a biography of Mary Wollstonecraft." And my first response was to say, there is already a biography of Mary Wollstonecraft, because there was one, an American one. But then I had to decide whether I would go back to my job at the Statesman or whether I'd try and write a life of Mary Wollstonecraft. Nick was still alive at that point, and we sat down together with bits of paper and wrote down pros and cons, writing the biography, going back to the New Statesman. And we agreed that I ought to try and write the biography. So that's what I did. And I can remember when I'd written some chapters, I gave Nick a chapter to read, and I went out of the room to leave him to read it, wanting his opinion, of course. When I came back into the room, he was fast asleep. Lesson for the biographer. So it was marvelous. It was absolutely thrilling. I knew
I knew that this is what I wanted to do, and I knew some historians like Richard Cobb who gave me advice about writing. For instance, he said, always write to archives, even if you think there's nothing to be found. And I knew that Mary Wollstonecraft's baby, Fanny, had been born in Le Havre during the French Revolution, which was called Havre Marat at that time. But I knew that Le Havre had been flattened by bombs in World War II. But I wrote off and said, do you by any chance have a record of the birth of a baby girl to someone called Mary Wollstonecraft? And a few weeks later, I got a brown envelope, and there was a birth certificate of Fanny. And she had the revolutionary date. It wasn't given May, it was Floréal, of course, in 1794. And that was, everyone here, you all know about biography. When something like that happens, it is more often you don't get treats like that, but that was just sort of amazing.
Yeah, that's the joy of biography,
yes.
the treasure hunt.
Yes,
and suddenly,
yes.
every once in a while, you actually
Yes.
discover something that's...
And I felt, again, I'm being a bit sentimental, I felt she was like a sister. There she was, so modern in the 1790s, living in North London, working on a magazine. I was having problems with men, having problems with babies, you know, and somehow...
There were a lot of similarities between your life and hers.
Well, yes, there were. Only she was, of course, really a great woman and an extraordinary woman. And of course, she died giving birth to her second daughter, Mary, who grew up to marry Shelley. So it was an extraordinary experience writing that book. And I learnt, I mean, it's like your first child, your first book. You learn a lot just by doing it.
So, speaking of the New Statesman, that was sort of a wonderful sort of literary circus in London in the
Yes,
70s
it was.
and 80s.
Yes, it was.
And you were a part of it and a witness to, I mean, you hung out with people like Martin Amis.
I gave him his job.
You gave him his job?
And Julian Barnes, I gave him his job.
And Christopher Hitchens,
Yes, Chris.
who was
Yes,
someone I ran into later. Now, did you read Christopher's memoir, Hitch 22?
I'm afraid I didn't, no.
Well, what did
I
you
should have done, I will, yes.
It's a good memoir, but it leaves a lot out.
Really? Well, he probably had to, you know.
Well, I was. That's indeed.
He was a terrific critic. He was. I mean, I never quite forgave him for changing his politics, but he was a very able and charming man, certainly.
Yeah, that was
Outstanding. He was an
political
outstanding
odyssey
figure.
is very odd at the end.
Yes. Yes.
What happened? Do you have any insights into that?
I don't know, because I didn't. I mean, I did write to him when he was ill, and we exchanged letters. But I was not so close to him.
So why have you, in retrospect, chosen to write about the long dead as opposed to more contemporary subjects?
Oh, well, I decided I didn't want to write about living subjects. I think it's too difficult. I've been asked to write some, and I just thought it's not what I want to do. I really like getting into the past. I think writing a biography is as much about context as about character, and to get into the period, to see what was going on. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft living through the extraordinary period in English history of political upheaval and the French Revolution. Is to me more what I want to do. Dickens, the whole Dickens thing, and Ellen Ternan went right back to my time at Cambridge when I was working on Dickens, and I read Edmund Wilson's The Two Scrooges, a wonderful essay on Dickens. And I read Edgar Johnson's 2-volume, which was the latest biography of Dickens, and they both mentioned Ternan, and they were rather slighting about her and described her as probably mercenary and not very interesting and failing Dickens's need and this sort of thing. And I was 19 then, and I thought, that is a story. They're not interested in her. They don't talk about where she came from. They don't say what happened to her after Dickens. And I kept that in my mind for years and years and years. And then when I was on the Sunday Times, someone came into the Sunday Times with a story for the editor about Dickens, and he said, "Oh, will you look into this?" And I went across to the Dickens Museum and talked to the curator. And when we finished talking about that, I said to him, "I've sometimes thought I'd like to write about Ellen Ternan." And he said, "I can't tell you how many people I've told not to do that." And then he paused and looked at me, and I had published my Wollstonecraft book. And he said, "But I think you might be the person to do it, and I will give you every assistance I can." And so I got into that story. That was another really exciting and interesting story. Her background in the theatre, her mother, her grandmother, and her sisters, and it was and the Dickens scholars were divided. Some of them disapproved of me very much and thought I shouldn't be seeking to blacken Dickens' name, but others, like Graham Story, who was one of the editors of the Dickens letters, whom I'd known from my days at Cambridge, he also helped me and approved of what I was doing. So there was a sort of people. Dickens means so much to English people. I think the idea that you should sort of suggest, but of course they already knew he'd behaved so badly to his wife, and in a way, to find out more about Ternan makes that more excusable, I think, than that if he'd just done it out of sort of horribleness.
So, coming back to your first book on Mary Wollstonecraft, your editor in 1973, you say, told you that he would not publish your biography if you submitted it as a PhD.
Oh, that's right, Tony Godwin. Yes, I thought I'd done original research, and I thought I would rather like, one is snobbish about these things. I thought I'd rather like a PhD. And that's what he said. He said, "I won't publish it." He also tried to persuade me to introduce fictional bits, and I absolutely refused.
He wanted you to fictionalize
He
part of
wanted me to put in some, fictional bits around the time when she was attempted suicide. And I said, "I'm not writing that sort of book. No, I won't." But he was.
So why didn't he want you to get the PhD parchment?
Because he wanted to sell the book as a popular book.
So this leads me to ask, why is there this suspicion in the academy, in the university world, against biography, and vice versa?
Well, I don't think I can really answer that, and I've been very lucky, as a matter of fact.
Academics have encouraged you.
Well, I don't say they've encouraged me, but they have, on the whole, been kind to me. I think if you do your work and get your history right and do get the context right, this is appreciated. But I think I told you, David Starkey, I'm told a famous English historian, has said to his students, to his male students, "Don't go for biography, leave that for the girls."
Whoa!
That's the sort of thing you meet. I mean, in France and Germany, on the continent, on the whole, biography is not well thought of. The English, we have such a wonderful tradition of biography, but of course biography goes right back to antiquities, as we know. I mean, people are interested in other people's lives. It is a very, very basic thing to be curious about other people's lives, to want to actually have a sort of almost live inside someone else's skin, to have a sort of go.
And just like when you were a little girl and you picked up that biography of Queen Elizabeth, it brought you into history. It taught you something about...
Yes, because he was a serious historian.
This is history you otherwise wouldn't have read necessarily. But because it was a biography, that's a vehicle that is accessible, right?
Yes, well, yes, absolutely. I did read history. I read Eileen Power, of course, who was a wonderful English historian who died young. I got her book, Medieval English Nunneries, which I remember my friends all laughed at me as I carried around this. That was pure history, of course, pure historical research.
So coming back to the memoir, you mentioned that you had access, of course, to your father's published memoir, where he told the story about your conception. But there was
a bit more, too.
a bit more, too. But I see at one point you refer to your own lost diaries. That you had diaries that disappeared.
Oh, well, my early diaries, yes, I think they got thrown out at some point, yes.
A tragedy.
They were probably very boring.
So what other sources did you use to write the memoir?
Well, I mentioned a bit. I mean, I had got from the time I first married in 1955, I have kept diaries, and even mostly they're not literary diaries at all, but they tell you a lot, your diaries, if you just see who you had lunch with, or, and you occasionally write in something, you note things. And when you come to read them, they do remind you of a lot. And I wrote down, as I say, various episodes of my life. I did actually write down accounts of them. And when my daughter Jo was working in Mozambique and I was working on the Sunday Times, she said, it was just before computers, keep carbons of your letters to me in case they get lost. And I did. So I've got all my account of my huge rows at the Sunday Times with Andrew Neil, the editor, and all that sort of thing. Absolutely fresh. That was quite useful.
So at one point, this reminds me, you tell a story from your childhood. I think you were 12, and you fell into a pool or a lake.
So swimming.
Swimming. And
I think I was I was not 12 then, no, I was more like 8. I'd read Tom Brown's School Days.
Yes.
And it said that if you threw yourself into water, you'd swim. Being a bookish girl, I believed what I read, and I was at this little private school, Christian Science private school with a swimming pool, and I threw myself into the swimming pool, and I can still remember sinking down through the green water and coming up, getting to the top, and thinking, and then I started sinking again, going down, and it was absolutely terrifying. And this girl called Julia Aston, I realized now was 12, but she was a strong and wonderful girl. She pulled me out. Julia Aston. I actually tracked her down when I was writing the book, and I found what had happened to her, and she had married a very rich man, actually, and she had just died when I was writing the book. So otherwise I would have, of course, written to her and said, goodness, do you remember pulling me out?
After all those years, yes.
Pulling me out of the swimming pool.
Let's see. We have maybe a minute or two, and then I want to open it up. Biography and memoir seem, so essential to our understanding of history. But at the end of your memoir, you rather glumly conclude, quote, that the lessons of history are never learned. So why do we biographers continue to scribble? Why do we make the attempt?
Well, but I don't think those two things are mutually contradictory, really. I mean, it's evident that the lessons of history are not learned. Just look around at the moment. I mean, I think we're in a worse state than we have been since the 30s when I was born. I really do. Everywhere, in Europe, in America, in the Middle East, and, everywhere. It's really profoundly upsetting and gloomy. But that doesn't make individual human lives less interesting, does it?
Absolutely.
Life goes on. People go on battling through difficult periods. And at the moment, things in America, America is such a lively country, and all your women rising up, the most extraordinary and admirable way. It's very exciting.
Yes, we live in exciting times. We don't know what's going to happen on Thursday. But I like to say, I empathize with that line. We never seem to learn our history. But nevertheless, I sort of console myself that we write biographies and memoirs for ourselves, to understand. I wrote a memoir, I think, just to try to figure out my own life and my family. And
yes,
I think that's partly why you've felt motivated to do so yourself.
I wanted to. And I did learn things. I mean, I think I learnt this basic thing, that you think you're making decisions for yourself all the time and really working things out. And in fact, most of the time, you're just doing whatever, you're swimming with the tide. You're just doing what everyone else is doing at the same time, and you don't realize it. And it's a bit of a shock, that, because one likes to think of oneself as being rather sort of boldly making one's way through the world.
Consciously choosing your own path.
Yeah, absolutely,
but
yes.
life is a series of accidents.
Yes, yes, and conflict too. Yes.
So is there anything else that you would like to talk about, anecdotes? I'll tell you one funny story that is not in the book, because my publishers wouldn't let me put it into the book. And it may not mean so much to you in America, but it makes English people laugh. I was one of the judges for the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry for several years, and we used to have lunch sometimes at Buckingham Palace. And Hermione Lee, my Dame Professor Hermione Lee, great biographer and scholar, at one point she was a fellow judge. And one day after we'd had this nice lunch that you get at Buckingham Palace, we said, might we use the facilities, please? So we were taken upstairs to a magnificent bedroom, one overlooking the front where they come out, which had a bathroom in it. So we used the bathroom, and then we stood in the bedroom, and we saw that it had an enormous bed with a red cover on it. And Hermione said, shall we bounce on the bed? I said yes. We took off our shoes, and we got on the bed, and we bounced. Now, Hermione says she doesn't remember this at all. But I think that's because she's become part of the establishment, and I haven't. And I think it was and
wonderful.
You're not.
I thought she was wonderful. I thought it was such a wonderful thing to do, and absolutely harmless, and sort of something you don't forget. But my publishers thought it was not suitable to be put into the book. Judge for yourselves.
Well, that's a lovely story to end on. And I want to now take
Questions is what I
time
like.
for
Yes,
questions from the audience. And I think there are microphones on either side.
Do you ever have the opposite idea than you just expressed, that you think you are being pushed and pulled and you have no agency of your own, and then in retrospect, you see that you've made these decisions to make your life what it is?
What is your question?
You said that you thought you were just going along with the flow and that you were not deciding for what your life would be. And I'm asking you if you've ever thought that was really the other way around, that you think you're being pushed and pulled, that you're a feather for every wind that blows. And then in retrospect, you see at critical moments you've made decisions that influence the rest of your life.
Well, no, that's very good, what you're saying, because one can see it from both points of view, and there are sometimes one sees it one way. And I certainly did make certain conscious decisions, like deciding to write my first book, which was a crucial decision. But I thought in general, we all sort of lived rather, we did all do the same things. For instance, I got married straight a year after I came down from college. We all married much too young, my generation, and we all did it, almost. And I think it was just sort of something that took hold of us as a generation. And perhaps it was the post-war generation. We were repeopling the world after the... and it's quite odd that... But yes, you're right, thank you. I mean, it is true that sometimes one does make decisions that change things for oneself.
Thank you.
Well, you remember the title of the book, A Life of My Own, actually comes from when you decided after Nick's death, tragically, that somehow a new chapter had opened up for you and you were going to now have a life of your own career.
Yes, yes. I mean, I grieved, of course, for Nick, but I also felt, I felt now, that word now I've got to do everything. I've got to be in charge. I've got to run my own life. And I felt that actually as something rather wonderful, as well as the grief. I felt I wanted to be in command of my own life.
I wanted to ask you about Invisible Woman. At the end of the book, you speculate about whether or not Dickens actually died at home or whether he died in her home. And I was wondering if anything has come up to either add to that belief or that possibility or subtract from it.
Did you hear? Did everybody hear that? Well, no, it hasn't. And I think about it and talk about it with friends sometimes. And I think if I said chances out of 10 that it was that, I think I'd still say there are about 4 out of 10. I think it is possible. I think the reasons I gave when I argued that through are good ones, and some people do think it's possible. But I also see that it's probably stretching things a bit. And it would be wonderful if some more evidence came, but I think it's probably unlikely to come now.
Uh-huh. Okay, thank
But
you.
it was very interesting to.
It was an amazing book. It was just so much fun to
Yes,
go
it was. Yes,
to
it
go
was
back
fun.
to.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
there are when you know.
Yes, because it was after
sometimes-
I'd published the book, when I sent this extra information.
Yes,
So it was,
yes.
as you know, yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yes, that sort of thing is fun, as you say.
Thank you.
When your husband, Michael Frayn, gives you the script of a new play he's written, do you make sure you don't fall asleep?
I'll tell you a story about that. He gave me the typescript of Spies, yes, to read. And I was going to France to give a talk, and I thought I'll take it and read it on the train. But I'm very tired, so I'll start reading it, and then I'll have a nice sleep. And I started reading it, and I could not put it down. I just could not put it down until I'd read it to the very end. So no, I don't fall asleep. Absolutely not.
I wanted to ask, in both your own memoir and then in writing other people's biographies, how you think about integrating their kind of professional accomplishments and what they've been able to do professionally and intellectually within themselves as people who have families, people, who kind of have these messy lives. And I mean, I think what I try to get out of what you've said and what other people have done is how do you integrate these two and put them together?
I couldn't quite. How do I?
Think about people's professional and intellectual accomplishments.
Yes.
But then as people, as family members,
Yes.
as these other roles in their lives. How do you
Yes.
put those together? Or think about weighing which is more important in writing.
Well, I suppose that is absolutely a fundamental problem. You're right. How you do them. I can't really say how. It's
But you don't fictionalize it.
Oh, I don't fictionalize it. No, I don't fictionalize it. I'm trying to think of, I mean, with men, on the whole, they managed to, in the past, to organize their lives so that Dickens could say, I'm always going to work for these hours, and then I'm always going to go for a walk. And he could do that, so someone else was doing the other things. With women, like Jane Austen, although Jane Austen was so good and well-behaved and perfectly loving to her family, just occasionally, she says, legs of mutton and doses of rhubarb make composition difficult. And you see her having to look after her nephews and you want to, you are aware that it was not always easy for her. But you do that from a tiny, I think it's the only quote you can find almost in which there's any suggestion that she might have liked to have had more freedom to work. And you know that Cassandra protected her, of course, that we do know.
So how have you dealt with people in your books when they do bad things? when they act, when they behave, you know, they're the hero of the story you're trying to tell, but
I haven't put much of my own bad behavior into my book either. It's difficult, but it's interesting, of course. Yes, how do you do it? I mean, Hardy was a pretty terrible husband, wasn't he? Thomas Hardy. He was a wonderful poet. He was a great man, but he wasn't a good husband. You have to put it in, don't you?
you have to. But do you have to do it in a way that is empathetic, or do you?
Yes, I think you do, of course. Yes, I think in for the first edition of my first book, Mary Wollstonecraft, I think I once or twice sort of ticked her off, and I took that out. I was not for a biographer to tick off the subject. You know, you really don't do that. But then you have to present things so that the reader can see how they were. And I mean, Dickens is obviously the great example of, as I said earlier, you know, he was a consciously good man who wished to do good, who longed and did enormous good, and was generous and gave time and energy to trying to make things better for people, so that it was terrible for him when he realized he was being a bad husband, and it made him worse. Wasn't a very good father either. Perhaps he didn't realize that quite enough. So you have to say then, I mean, even with Pepys, I think just once or twice in my life of Pepys, I do actually have to say that I thought his behavior was appalling. But with Pepys, after all, we only know because he tells us himself.
He tells it himself.
Tells us himself. So he's trusted us. He's given us himself. And that is what makes him the most extraordinary person ever, I think, the sort of a modern man there in the 17th century, who was curious about the world and who was as curious about himself and could sort of tell us those things.
Could you comment on how you chose the personalities that you decided to write about? And did you alluded to Margaret Thatcher, I think, in your early comments. Is Margaret Thatcher someone that you've thought about writing about? And finally, are there any Americans that intrigue you enough to consider writing about?
Yes, I did think I would have liked to have written about Mrs. Thatcher. It's true. I thought she was a very good subject, but then other people wrote, first of all, Hugo Williams, I knew, then Charles Moore's written 2 volumes. Americans, well, it'd be wonderful, but I'm not sure I would know enough. I'm not sure that you have so many magnificent biographers, some of whom I see before me, that I think I would be trespassing on the territory that's very, very well dealt with. So I don't think I would ever. It's a bit late for me now, anyhow.
So do you have a new project?
Well, I do, yes, but it's quite a small one, and it's quite sort of, you know, I am 85, and it's whether I'll get it, you know. I want to write about the early life of H.G. Wells up to about when he was about 40, because I think those science fiction stories will be read as long as people read, and I think his early novels, Tone Bungay and Mr. Polly and Kipps, I mean, they are absolutely extraordinary. And then later on, he became a very indifferent writer. I mean, he became a sort of official writer. He wrote good history of the world and that sort of thing, and he became a public figure. And I think I want to write partly about what happened, the change, you know, that he really was absolutely amazing when he was young, and it was partly because he was ill all the time, and he kept having breakdowns, I think, and he had a frightful struggle. And he said he never felt well until he was 40, and then suddenly being well and suddenly being very attractive to lots of young women, he sort of he changed his life quite in every possible way. But he stopped being a great writer. But he was such a fascinating, amazing young man, and his struggle to get...
But success ruined him.
Well, I didn't say it ruined him, but he's not really interesting, I think, after, after he's 40. No, I think he's not interesting. I don't say he didn't do interesting things. He did. There's been a lot written about him, but I thought there was this question of him being so extraordinary, having to fight to get any education, having to fight his way. It is.
The struggle is the interesting
Yes,
part. Yeah.
yes. I just like him. I like him a lot. I feel a lot of sympathy for him. And his mother was a housekeeper in an extraordinary grand house in England, and I've got to know it quite well. And it became sort of his home in a way. And when he was very ill, they let him go and be ill there. And they probably saved his life too, because they brought in a doctor to. He totally lost one kidney, and he had symptoms of tuberculosis. I mean, he was really had a struggle physically, and grew out of it in the end. So that's if I could do that, I'd quite like to manage if I could write a short book. But whether I would be able to, I don't know.
I guess my question was similar to the man who just asked before. How did you get from Mary Who to Jane Austen?
How did I get from Mary Who to Jane Austen?
Yeah.
Well, it's a good, because after Mary Wollstonecraft, I wrote about Mrs. Jordan, and then somebody said, what about Jane Austen? And I, of course, read Jane Austen all my life and reread her with my daughters, and I realized they were the same period, the women of the same period, and I thought, I know that period very, very well, and it would be wonderful. And I immediately thought I wouldn't have dared to think of writing about Jane Austen, but I was so happy to do it, and I so much enjoyed doing it. And of course, she's now become a really world industry. I'm not sure it's altogether good for great writers to become world industries, though. It can be sort of too much. Too much, yes, yes. But yes, it was. And I'm very lucky. American friends have said to me, "You're so lucky living in North London," which I did then, and all your subjects were around you. And Jane Austen made it very easy for me to. I used to get a very early train down to Winchester, and I would sort of work in the archives there, and then walk around. Michael walked with me. It helped me a lot walking around in Jane Austen's footsteps. So it's very important, I think, to walk in the footsteps.
That's because the place is important?
The places are very, very important. The places, the houses, the climate, yes, all that.
Thank you. I'm afraid my question might be unanswerable, but you mentioned
Could you speak up?
You mentioned that there's a lot that you couldn't put into your biography because it would mess it up or something? Or
My memoir, yes.
And I wondered, in writing a biography, there are the events of the life, and then is there an arc of the life that you discover in doing the research, and is there one that you give more emphasis to than the other? Do you look more at the arc? I mean, is that an important part of writing a biography?
That's very interesting. Yes. I think the arc of the life is very, very important. I suppose that's one reason in my later biographies, I tended to not always start at the beginning, but go into some important moment in the life which I thought threw a great deal of light onto the subject, and then go back to the beginning. Perhaps that doesn't sound as though I'm making the arc, but I think it does sort of help you to see the arc. I suppose you hope that if you write it as well as you can, the reader will get the sense of the arc. You can't exactly spell it out, can you? It's got to emerge from the narrative, this sense of the movement, the arc of the life. I'll think about that. Thank you. That's a very, very interesting, good question, which I haven't really answered, but I'm grateful for it. Yes.
I'm very, very fond of your biography of Thomas Hardy, and in general adore all of Hardy. And you say you still live with your subjects. In the case of Hardy, do you also then live with his characters, some of his characters, because of course they were part of him? Do you think about Clem and Tess and Jude and Eustacia and all of them? Do they also live along with you as Hardy lives along with you?
Yes, they do. They do, because they are so. As you say, part of him was in so many of those characters. Yes.
What may I just ask? What drew you to Hardy?
I'd been reading his poetry from childhood, and when I was at Cambridge, George Rylands, Dadie Rylands, who was a great English don and actor too, I heard he was going to give a Hardy lecture, and I went, and he read all the poems to Emma, the poems of 1912, 1913, and I've never forgotten it. It was just, he was a marvelous reader, and they are such great poems, and they occupy such an important place in Hardy's life, so that when I came to write my biography, I started it in that year. And after that, I read everything I could about Hardy, and I read all his novels, and went to Dorset when I could. Always hoped to go and live in Dorset, but never managed to. It was very, very, very important to me, Hardy. I went to Cornwall, and I had the good luck to be asked to make a television program by Melvyn Bragg. So we went and we filmed and all the places, and trod the same paths, the paths Hardy walked from home to school, and where he was with Emma in Cornwall. Yes, I'm very pleased you like the Hardy book, because it's one I've really loved working on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.